Well, I've stolen Sam Harvey away from the main stage. He'll be back up there soon. But right now, we're here in the studio and we're just going to have a wee chat. So, Sam, I believe you've been moving around the countryside these days. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so we've moved from Christchurch to Napier, and we moved last July, and we went through a whole process of discernment about 7 months earlier. We kind of had this kind of random weekend where me and my wife were talking and then started praying as we kind of went to sleep, which turned into this big long prayer session because we started to feel like, oh my gosh, I think we're meant to leave Christchurch. I think we knew almost immediately that weekend, but because it was such a big decision with the role that we were carrying at our church in Christchurch, Grace Vineyard, and because of children and house and all the rest of it, it was like we really need to make sure that this is God. And so we went through a 3-month kind of discernment process about what God was saying to us, and it ended up with us being in Napier.
How do you go through that process of discernment and cut through the distraction and probably even the voices that are saying, nah, you're just barking up the wrong tree?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely didn't want to make a decision after one night. You know, it could have been the curry that night and you wake up the next day and it's like, oh, okay, maybe not. And so again, it was like probably about 2 or 3 months of solid prayer into that. And there were 4 kind of big components to that discernment process. Number one, we really felt like God spoke to us through His Word. So it was like, man, passages started jumping out at us that we hadn't really taken too much notice of before. My wife, a couple of days after we first had this big yarn, was opening her Advent devotional, and the text for that day was Genesis 12, where Abram was called to a land I will show you. And so she rings me up and it's like, okay. I was just looking through the Bible and I remember just seeing this passage in Acts where Paul's leaving this group and he's at the dock and they're all emotional and he's off to go to this new place to do mission work. And again, just all these kind of moments. So we had to kind of felt like God spoke through His Word, through the Spirit of God. So we started getting dreams and stuff, but also we got all these random prophecies and people we hadn't seen for ages would email us, and we weren't talking to anyone because it was big news at that point. But third point was then we started talking to some very, very close friends of ours. So we didn't do this just in isolation. We got a community. Steve Graham, who you interviewed the other day, he was one of those voices. He actually said to me, I've seen a lot of guys make dumb decisions in their mid-30s. So I was like, oh, cool, thanks, man. But I appreciate it. He was like, just really make sure this is just not an itch because you're mid-30s and you want to, having a third life crisis or something. So we did it. So we had all these voices that began to pray and speaking to us, but a very, very small group, the circle of trust. and then lastly, we submitted it to the leadership of our church, Dave and Lizzie McGregor, after 2 or so months of really wrestling with it. And we told Dave, we think God's calling us on. He was very grateful that we told him very early because we didn't know where at that point. He went home that night, he felt, in the middle of the night, he woke up a bit worried. Felt the peace of God just rest on him and say, this is of me, and it's right. And so we just had this lovely farewell from them, and they've just been such a blessing to us. And then it was the process of discerning where, and that was a whole other story.
So, do you want to tell us about
Sure.
that?
Well, okay, so then it was like, we literally looked at the whole, it was like where? And it was a really cool feeling, but quite scary. Like, is it cross-cultural? Is it, we had no clue. Everything was on the table. So we started praying and we looked at cross-cultural mission and we dismissed it relatively early simply because I feel like the call of God in my life, and my wife's the same, is that we're called to serve the church here in New Zealand. We love mission and we're going to be involved in some overseas stuff, but we didn't feel like God was calling us overseas because we love the church in New Zealand so much. And so we're like, okay, we feel like God's called us to New Zealand. So we looked at the map of New Zealand. I was like, where are you calling us, God? So our national director of the Vineyard, a guy called Louis Rankin, said some amazing things. He said, God's no is often louder than his yes. So he said, his advice was get your feet on the ground in some cities where you think God might be calling you, and just get a sense of whether there's a no or a yes. And so we did that. We flew to Wellington. Now, we'd been a pastor here in Wellington. We loved the Anglicans here. It was like an obvious choice because we had history here. We turned up to one to talk to Justin Duckworth, a few other people, but within like half an hour we both knew no. Yeah. So we then tried to pray about it and stuff, but we just knew it wasn't right, and we're like, oh, we couldn't live in Wellington. Now, we love Wellington, but for whatever reason it wasn't right. So we visited a few places, and then someone suggested we go to Napier. So we had a look at Napier, and we flew in there, And it was just a very different experience. And we just felt like God really started speaking to us. We didn't know anyone there. We'd both been there as kids on holiday once when we were very little. Everything was new to us. And things just began to fall in place. Kids could get into the school that freed us from zoning things, and lots of little things just fell into place, and it just felt like this was the right place. And since we've moved there, it's been sort of this sense of, yes, this is so where God wants us. So we're on that kind of adventure of like, okay, how's this going to play out? But so far, God has been so good and so faithful to us, so we're confident that will continue.
Oh, awesome. We could go on, but I think we've run out of time. Yeah. So thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks.